It is 2 in the morning, and you are awake because you paid to be. £500 bought you, and as many as 7 others a night that most people would pay to avoid. A private tour after the gates close, a few ghost stories told in rooms lit low, and then this. A small bedroom near the top of Muncaster Castle, hung with old Flemish tapestries, furnished with heavy Georgian pieces, an Elizabethan fireplace cold in the dark. You have a flask of coffee going warm in your hands. The rest of the castle has gone quiet in the way only very old stone goes quiet, a silence with weight in it. And you are sitting up, facing the far end of the room, the window end, listening. Because that is where visitors say it comes from. Not footsteps in the corridor, though people report those too, and not the door handle turning on its own, though that is in the accounts as well. What you are listening for is smaller and worse than any of that. A child crying. People have described it for decades, coming from near the window, sometimes with a woman's voice underneath it. Low and even, the sound of someone singing to a sick child to settle it back to sleep. You strain toward the dark end of the room. The coffee goes cold, and nothing you have read prepares you for how long a night can be when you are waiting for it. This is the room they sell. This is the whole strange proposition of Muncaster Castle, and to understand how a family ended up putting a price on a haunted bedroom, you have to understand the family, and to understand the family you have to understand the house, because at Muncaster the house and the family are nearly the same thing, held together across 8 centuries by an unbroken thread of one name. Muncaster stands at Ravenglass on the coast of Cumbria, at the western edge of the Lake District, where the fells run down toward the Irish Sea. It is a green and remote corner of England, and the estate there has been Pennington land for a very long time. The first firm record puts it at 1208, when the land was granted to a man called Alan de Pennington, and it is from that name, Pennington, Pennington, that everything else descends. Some family accounts push the tenure back even further to 1026, though the paper thins out that far back, and the safer date is the one written down. 1208. Either way, the number is staggering. One family, one site, held without a break for more than 800 years. There are not many places in England that can say that, and Muncaster says it plainly, in stone. The stone is the proof. A castle proper was raised on the site in the later 13th century, and then in the 14th century it was enlarged, and the piece they added is the piece that matters most. A Pele Tower. If you have never been to this part of the country, the word may mean nothing, but on the Anglo-Scottish border, a Pele Tower was a specific and serious thing. A squat, thick-walled fortified tower, built to hold out against raiders, a place you could pull your family and your livestock into and bar the door while the men on the ground outside did their worst. The Muncaster Tower was set on Roman foundations because the Romans had been at Ravenglass long before any Pennington, and their groundwork was still good enough to build on 1,000 years later. That 14th century Pele Tower has never come down. It is still there. And this is the extraordinary thing about the house. Everything you see around it now was built later, wrapped over it, grown around it, and the old tower simply sits inside the newer house like a stone kept inside a closed fist. The fist opens and closes with the centuries, the fashions change, the roofs go on and come off, and the stone in the middle does not move. The newer house came in 2 great pushes, and both of them tell you something about how close this family came to losing everything long before the ghosts were ever a selling point. The first push was in 1783. By then, the castle the Penningtons had held for over 500 years was, quite literally, falling down around them. Decades of decay had set in under Sir Joseph Pennington, a long, slow neglect. the kind that does not announce itself until suddenly it does. The old mortar had gone soft and dry, crumbling out from between the stones like dried bread when you touch it. And there is a moment recorded from that year that says everything. Sir John Pennington, Joseph's heir, came back to Muncaster from his own wedding, a man arriving with his new wife to take up his inheritance. And as he walked the building to inspect what he now owned, part of the structure gave way and came down while he was looking at it. Not a metaphor. He watched a piece of his family's ancient house collapse in front of him on the day he came home to it. So he rebuilt. The 1783 work is the reason Muncaster survived that generation at all, a substantial reconstruction that stabilized what centuries of neglect had nearly finished off. And notice, even then, at the lowest point, nobody touched the Pale Tower. It stood through the collapse. It stood through the rebuild. The second push came the following century, and it is the one that gives Muncaster the look it wears today. Between 1862 and 1866, the architect Anthony Salvin, one of the great Victorian country housemen, remodelled Muncaster for Gamel Augustus Pennington. Salvin turned it into the large, confident, largely Victorian mansion that visitors walk through now. All the grandeur and the long rooms and the sense of a house built to be seen. 4 years of work, a family with money enough to want the fashionable thing, and a serious architect to deliver it. And once again, inside all of Salvin's new confident stonework, the medieval Pele Tower was left exactly as it was, unaltered, the oldest heart of the place preserved right in the middle of the newest skin. That is the layered truth of the building. Roman foundations at the bottom, a 14th century fortified tower on top of them, a 1783 rescue wrapped around that, and Salvin's Victorian house wrapped around all of it. You can stand in one building and be standing in 4 different centuries at once. Now the family who did all this, the thread that runs the whole length of it is simple and almost hard to believe. It is always a Pennington. Grant to Alan de Penitone in 1208. The tower raised by Penningtons in the 14th century. The house nearly lost under Sir Joseph and hauled back by Sir John in 1783. The Victorian mansion built out for Gamel Augustus Pennington in the 1860s. One name, carried hand to hand down the generations, through wars and marriages and deaths, and the slow business of keeping a very large, very old house standing on a wet stretch of the Cumbrian coast. And in that same year of the Great Rebuild, 1783, the family standing was formalized in a new way. A barony was created, a title, so that the head of the family would now be a Baron Muncaster, the name of the place, fused directly to the rank. That is the thing to hold on to as this story goes forward, because a title is a fragile object. Land can pass to a daughter. A house can pass to a niece or a cousin. But a barony of that kind passed only through sons, and it existed only as long as there were sons to carry it. For the moment, in 1783, none of that mattered. The house was saved. The tower stood. The family held the land it had always held, and now they held a title on top of it. 800 years of holding on, and it must have felt, at last, secure. It was not. But that is later. For now, hold the picture. The green estate at Ravenglass, the old Pele Tower buried unbroken inside Salvin's grand Victorian walls, the Roman stones under all of it, and one family threading through every century of it without ever once letting go. For over 700 years the Penningtons held Muncaster without a break, and by 1917 the man carrying the family's title, Josslyn Pennington, was the 5th Baron Muncaster and the last. For over 700 years the Penningtons held Muncaster without a break, and by 1917 the man carrying the family's title, Josslyn Pennington, was the 5th Baron Muncaster and the last. It is worth sitting with that word for a moment, because it does most of the work in this part of the story. Last, not disgraced, not bankrupt, not driven out by scandal or debt or fire, simply last. The record here does not need a ghost to make it heavy. It needs only a calendar, a couple of names, and the plain arithmetic of a family that ran out of the one thing the law of the day demanded of it, which was a son. Josslyn Frances Pennington had been born into a house that seemed permanent in the way old stone always seems permanent, which is to say, permanent right up until it isn't. The barony he held had been created in 1783, the same decade the castle itself was being rebuilt around the medieval tower at its core. So the title and the modern house were roughly the same age. They had grown up together. A man standing in the great rooms in 1900 could have told himself, with some justice, that the Pennington barony was as solid as the walls, that both had stood for well over a century and would stand for centuries more. That is the thing about a long inheritance. It teaches you to expect continuation. It does not prepare you for a year in which the whole thread runs out at once, because that is what happened. On the 30th of March 1917, Josslyn Frances Pennington, 5th Baron Muncaster, died at the castle. He died at home, in the house his family had held since 1208, in the middle of the First World War, while the wider country was counting its dead in numbers no one could quite hold in the mind. His was one quiet death among an ocean of them. An old man dying in his own bed in Cumbria, while younger men were dying in their thousands in France. And in the ordinary run of things, that death would simply have passed the title down. The barony would have moved to the next in line, the house would have carried on, and the story would have continued the way it had continued for more than 500 years. A death, a succession, a new holder of an old name. But there was no next in line, not in the way the title required. Josslyn Pennington left a daughter. He did not leave a son, and the barony, created in 1783, was one of those titles that could only pass through the male line. So at the exact moment of his death, with no male heir to receive it, the barony did not pass to anyone. It stopped. A title that had existed since the 1780s, that had been carried by 5 men across well over a century, simply ceased to exist. There was no ceremony for that, no formal ending, no announcement that fit the scale of it. One morning, the 5th Baron Muncaster was alive and the title was real. And by the end of that day, the man was dead and the title was extinct. A thing that had lasted since the reign of George III was gone inside a single spring. And then the calendar does the cruelest part of the work. Because Josslyn was not the only loss in that house that year. His wife, Constance Anne, born Constance Anne Lestrange, died on the 13th of July 1917. Do the counting, and it comes to roughly 15 weeks. 15 weeks between the death of the husband and the death of the wife. A little under 4 months, long enough to bury him and settle the first shock, not long enough to do anything that could be called recovering. Whatever the medical cause on her certificate, and the record gives us the date rather than a diagnosis, the shape of it is unmistakable to anyone who has watched an old couple who have shared a house for decades. One goes and the other follows before the year is out. The pair of them, the last baron and his baroness, gone from the same castle inside a single 15-week span. So think about what 1917 actually meant inside those walls. In the space of 1 year, the house lost the man who held its title, lost the woman who had shared his life, and lost the title itself, all 3 at once. The family did not end. That is important, and I want to be exact about it, because this is not the story of a bloodline dying out. There was a daughter. There were relations. The Penningtons went on. The estate stayed in the family's orbit. The land granted to Alan de Penetone in 1208 did not suddenly belong to strangers. What ended was the barony. The specific honour created in 1783 thinned down, generation by generation, holder by holder, until by 1917 it hung on one man, and when that one man died with only a daughter to follow him, the thread that had been paying out since the 1780s finally reached its end, and there was nothing more to give. You can picture the whole barony that way, as a thread. In 1783 it is thick and new, freshly spun, wound around a family that had already held the ground for 5.5 centuries. Through the 1800s, it pays out steadily, holder to holder, each baron passing it to the next, and then it begins to thin. Fewer sons, narrower branches, the line drawing in toward a single point. By the time it reaches Josslyn, it is down to one strand, one man, one life. And in 1917, that last strand parts. The house is still standing, the family is still there, but the title that had once seemed as solid as a stone has thinned to nothing and slipped away. The wider cost of that war is written into the estate in another way, in stone that is still there to be read. The First World War did not only take the 5th Baron in his bed. It took the young men of the district, the way it took the young men of every district in Britain, in numbers that hollowed out a generation. Sir John Fresherville Ramsden, who held the Muncaster estate through the years of that war, is remembered through a war memorial on the estate itself. It was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, the same architect whose hand shaped so much of Britain's public grief in those years, the man behind the cenotaph in London, and the great memorial arches abroad. His Muncaster Memorial was built in 1922, 4 years after the guns stopped, when the country was still working out how to carry what it had lost. That is worth holding on to. In the same handful of years that the house lost its baron and its barony, the community around it was raising stone to its own dead. The tragedy inside the castle and the tragedy across the whole parish were not separate events. They were the same war, felt at every level at once, from the extinction of an ancient title to the names of farm boys carved into a Lutyens memorial. And here is the point I want to be careful about, because the temptation with a house like this is always to reach for the supernatural. Muncaster has a reputation. It sells that reputation, but the real turn in its story, the documented low point, has nothing to do with any of that. It is a barony that ran out of male heirs in 1917, and an estate that, decades later, could not pay for its own roof. Those are the facts. Name people, real dates, plain sums. The house does not need an invented ghost to explain its hardest years, because the record already holds something heavier, which is the ordinary, unavoidable weight of death and money and time working on a family that had stayed in one place for too long to leave. Because the house did survive. That is the strange thing about Muncaster. It took the blow of 1917, and it kept going. It came through the First World War, and it came through the Second. During the Second World War, the castle even served as a place of safety, taking in roughly 700 works of art evacuated from the Tate Gallery in London. Pictures by Turner and Manet and Van Gogh sent north out of the reach of the Blitz. So the walls that had lost a baron were, a generation later, trusted to guard some of the most valuable paintings in the country. The house endured. It absorbed 2 wars and the death of its title and the deaths of the couple at its heart. And it was still standing when the 20th century began to wind down. And that is exactly why the next part matters, because surviving the wars turned out not to be the same thing as being safe. A house is not saved by the mere fact of remaining upright. It has to be paid for. Roofs have to be replaced. Stone has to be repointed. Damp has to be fought back year after year. And all of that costs money that a private family has to find from somewhere. By the late 20th century, Muncaster had slid into the kind of structural decay that puts a building's whole future in doubt. Not drama, not a single catastrophe, just the slow, patient work of weather and time on a very large and very old house, and bills that grew faster than any private income could meet. You can feel that decay most honestly if you think about water. Not a haunting, not a cold spot in the corner of a bedroom, just water. Rain finding the weak places in an old roof and working its way in, spreading behind the plaster, staining the ceilings, coming through drop by drop, the way it always does in a house that has outrun the money needed to keep it dry. The losses on the estate were like that too. Not a sudden collapse, but a steady seep, a bleed that never quite stopped, running money out of the family the way water runs through a cracked ceiling, patient and constant and impossible to ignore for long. Every year the gap between what the estate cost and what it earned was money the family had to find, and every year the water found a little more of the roof. Put a number on it, and the picture sharpens. According to Peter Frost-Pennington, the man who would eventually take on the running of the place, by the 1980s the estate was losing about £50,000 every single year. Read that plainly. £50,000 a year in the 80s, gone. Not once, but annually, a fresh loss every 12 months, on top of the last. That is not a house with a cash flow problem. That is a house quietly bleeding out. And it puts the whole thing in a very clear and very unromantic light. Muncaster had come through more than 700 years of family ownership, through medieval sieges and a Georgian rebuild and a Victorian remodel, through the extinction of its own barony and through 2 world wars. And by the late 20th century, the thing that threatened it was not a curse and not a ghost and not an enemy at the gate. It was a spreadsheet. It was £50,000 a year going out that never came back in. So the story of the turn ends not with a title, but with a sum. The barony was already long gone, lost in that 15-week stretch of 1917, when Josslyn and Constance both died, and there was no sun to catch what fell. That question, of whether the Penningtons would keep their honour, had been answered decades earlier, and the answer had been no. What remained was a harder and more ordinary question, the one that faces every family clinging to a house too big and too old to easily hold. By the 1980s, Peter Frost-Pennington reckoned the estate was losing £50,000 a year. And the question was no longer whether the Penningtons would keep their title, but whether they could keep their roof. By the 1980s, Peter Frost-Pennington reckoned the estate was losing £50,000 a year. And the question was no longer whether the Penningtons would keep their title, but whether they could keep their roof. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment, because it is the number that decides everything that follows. £50,000 a year, every year, bleeding out of a house that had already stood for 8 centuries. A family can absorb a bad year. A family can absorb a bad decade if the good years on either side are fat enough. What a family cannot absorb is a slow, grinding, permanent deficit against a building that is physically falling apart faster than the money comes in. Slates work loose. Water gets behind the stone. Timbers that have held their shape since the reign of one king begin, quietly, to give up. A leaking roof is not a cosmetic problem in a house like this. It is the beginning of the end, and everyone who has ever owned such a place knows it. So the story of the modern castle is not really a ghost story at all. It is a story about a roof, and about the people who decided the roof was worth saving. The people who made that decision were Phillida Gordon Duff Pennington and her husband Patrick. Patrick was born in 1930 and lived until 2021, which means he gave the greater part of a long life to a single building. Together, they took what has honestly been described as a crumbling relic and spent 3 decades turning it back into something that could pay for itself. That is the part that gets lost in the retelling. 3 decades. Not a heroic weekend, not a single burst of restoration captured for the cameras, but 30 years of the unglamorous, expensive, never finished work of keeping a very old house standing. From 1968, they began opening it regularly to the public, and that date matters as much as any battle or barony in the whole account, because 1968 is the year Muncaster stopped being purely a private home and started being a place that strangers paid to walk through. The logic was brutally simple. If the house could not afford itself, the house would have to earn its keep. The gates opened. The visitors came. The money they left behind went, more or less directly, back into the fabric of the walls that had let them in. For years the scaffolding stood wrapped around the castle like a splint around a broken limb, holding the shape of the thing while the slow repair went on underneath. And by the late 1990s, the single most important piece of that repair was finally done. The family completed the re-roofing of the castle under a scheme they called the Third Millennium Muncaster Project, a name pitched deliberately at the future rather than the past. The same project rejuvenated the bird gardens and the Hawk and Owl Centre out on the grounds, so that the estate offered a visitor more than one reason to spend a day there. But the roof was the heart of it. Once a house of this age is watertight again, once the weather is finally locked out, the clock that has been running against it slows almost to a stop. The restoration set hard, like fresh plaster, and for the first time in a very long while, the future of the building was not in serious doubt. That should have been the end of the danger. It very nearly was. And then, more than 2 decades after the roof went back on, the whole world stopped. And every attraction that survived on the money strangers left behind found that the strangers had gone home and would not be coming back for a while. The COVID-19 pandemic closed Muncaster the way it closed everything else. A privately owned house that funds its own survival out of visitor income is exquisitely exposed to a year in which there are no visitors. The gates that had been the answer in 1968 were now, briefly, the problem. In October 2021, the rescue came from an unfamiliar direction. Muncaster received close to £200,000 from the United Kingdom government's Cultural Recovery Fund, a national pot of some £35 million set up to keep exactly this kind of place alive through exactly this kind of year. The money did 2 jobs at once. It replaced the visitor income the castle had lost while its doors were shut, and it paid for further structural work, more roofing and damp proofing, the same eternal war against water that every owner of the house has fought in turn. It is a strange and very modern footnote to an 800-year story. The house that survived the Wars of the Roses and 2 world wars was, in the end, partly kept upright by a pandemic relief grant. The same year that brought the grant also brought a change of hands. In 2021, ownership passed to Peter and Iona Frost-Pennington. And it is Peter whose blunt arithmetic, about £50,000 a year, has run underneath this whole account. Their son, Ewan Frost-Pennington, now serves as the castle's operations director, which is to say, the next generation is already in place and already working. This is the detail that separates Muncaster from so many of its peers. It did not become a museum. It did not pass to a trust that keeps the rooms as they were and hangs velvet ropes across the doorways. It remains a privately owned, family-run estate, and the family still lives on the site. The people whose ancestors were granted this land in 1208 are still here, still upstairs, still making the decisions about the roof. More than 90,000 visitors a year now come through, and every one of them is walking through someone's home. And this is where the ghosts at last become a business, because the castle does not simply tell you it is haunted and leave it there. It sells you the chance to test the claim yourself, overnight, for a fixed price, as a line item on its own website. The product has a name. It is called the Ghost Sit, and it is precisely what it sounds like. You arrive in the evening, and you are taken on a private tour of the castle after the day visitors have gone, in the dark, with the ghost stories told in the rooms where they are said to have happened. Then you are left to spend the whole night inside the small bedroom that sits at the centre of the castle's entire reputation. The room hung with Flemish tapestries, furnished in the Georgian style, with an Elizabethan fireplace. In the morning, assuming you have slept at all, you are given breakfast at the Stables Cafe on the site. You must be 17 or older to take part, and the price for all of it is £500 for a group of up to 8 people, which works out at about £62.50 a head at full capacity, though the castle gently notes that 6 is a more comfortable number for the space. It is a remarkable thing to see written down so plainly. A night in what the marketing calls the most haunted room in the country. Costed, dated, and bookable, sitting on a website next to the opening hours and the price of a family ticket to the Owl Centre. The castle is not coy about the machinery behind the claim either. It states that scientific paranormal research into the building has been ongoing since 1992. More than 3 decades of investigators arriving with their instruments to sit where you will sit and record what you will listen for. That sustained interest is itself the selling point. The house does not ask you to believe. It asks you to come and find out, and it charges you accordingly. You can be as skeptical as you like about what waits in that room. And the honest version of this story invites you to be. What is not in doubt is everything around the room. The land really has been in one family since 1208. The barony really did die out in 1917 when a man and his wife followed one another into the ground inside 15 weeks. The estate really was losing £50,000 a year in the 1980s. The roof really was rebuilt across 30 patient years and finished at last as one century turned into the next. The grant really did arrive in the autumn of 2021. Those are the load-bearing facts, the plaster and the slate and the ledger, and they are the reason there is still a castle here at all for anyone to be frightened in. The ghost is the reason people book. The roof is the reason there is a room to book. That is the whole trick of the place, and Muncaster has never pretended otherwise. It took the oldest and least reliable thing it owned, the story of a crying child at the window, and it turned that story into part of the income that keeps the newest and most reliable thing, the watertight roof, in good repair. The unprovable pays for the provable. The legend keeps the stone dry. Stand back from it now, at the end of the whole long account, and look at what actually survives on the site. A 14th century Pele tower, still standing on Roman foundations, sealed inside a Georgian rebuild, wrapped again inside a Victorian mansion, the whole thing finely weatherproof and full of paying strangers by day and one family by night. A grandfather who died in 2021, having given 30 years to the roof. A son who runs the operation now. A small bedroom at the heart of it that has been listened to for more than a century and studied for more than 30 years, and that you can rent tonight if you have the nerve and the money. Today, more than 90,000 visitors a year walk the corridors outside the Tapestry room. And for £500, a group of up to 8 can still buy a night inside Britain's most haunted room, waiting by the window for a child who has been crying at Muncaster longer than anyone can prove.